Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We are really excited to be talking about this, and I'm so excited to be presenting with Chris, especially today because there's a lot going on in this space, and there's a brand new research study that just came out that Chris authored on Bloomberg. So really, really thrilled to be here talking about mapping the gaps, getting ahead of pay and opportunity equity with you today. So I wanted to talk through a couple of housekeeping things, just really quickly as we go through. So this is our agenda, and as you can see, it's a pretty packed agenda of topics that we wanted to cover today. And throughout this, we're going to be talking about some of the laws around pay and opportunity gaps. And although I am a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer, and so we don't provide legal advice at Syndio. So nothing that we talk about today should be taken as legal advice. Please use the Q&A or the chat features to submit your questions, and we'll answer all of the questions at the end of the session. One note that if you use the Q&A portion and you submit anonymously, we wouldn't be able to follow up with you directly with an answer if we're not able to cover it. So if you'd like to see a response, please make sure to submit using your name so that we can make sure to follow up with you. We will be sending out the deck today and a recording of all of the webinar to all participants and all registrants. And we also have the live transcript enabled for this webinar. So if you'd like to use this feature, it's pretty handy, please turn it on in your Zoom toolbar setting now so that you can see that transcript. For folks that are, we have a lot of friends here today, so thrilled to see so many of your names on the registration list. But we also have some folks that are new to Syndio, so I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Syndio. Syndio is a expert-backed technology that helps employers measure, achieve, and sustain workplace equity. So we have a best-in-class workplace equity analytics platform that allows you to analyze, resolve, and prevent disparities in both pay and opportunity. We also help employers with their global pay gap reporting obligations, as we'll talk about a little bit more today. But it's all expert backed. So we have expert support and consulting with legal best practices, statistics, reporting, total rewards, and communications guidance and support. And I think that that's really what differentiates Syndio. And certainly what drew me to Syndio was the fact that it was this mix of really sophisticated technology, but also the expert advice and support that spanned that wide array of areas, which is really what I think employers need to be able to sustain their workplace equity platform. We work with more than 300 customers, including more than 30% of Fortune's most admired organizations. So the amazing organizations that are listed below are just a handful of our customers that have allowed us to share their logos, but many more also work with us in a more confidential way. We've analyzed data for nearly 8 million employees across our 300 industry leaders. So we're so proud of our customers and all of the work that they're doing. We're also proud to share that Syndio was named number 20 on Fortune's 2023 Change the World list. This is not one of those pay-to-play recognitions, but something that was earned by Syndio as we were selected as one of 50 companies. And we're shoulder to shoulder with organizations like Apple and Patagonia and Walmart and Microsoft on this list. So we're really thrilled and really thrilled to be with you today. Today, I'm joined by one of my favorite Syndioans, and that's Chris Martin. Chris Martin is a research economist at Syndio. He focuses his research on issues of identity-based exclusion in the workplace. So he has original research that has explored pay and opportunity gaps, the impact of the salary history, disclosure laws on job offers, the link between employee engagement and compensation. And Chris, it's really nice to be with you, especially today, because Chris has original research that was published today in Bloomberg. And I think that Michelle is going to drop the link for that research to show you. And it's really right on this issue, which is the intersection of how do the laws impact the pay gaps that we're seeing across the US. My name is Christine Hendrickson, and I sit on Syndio's strategy team. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives. And so I was previously a partner and the co-chair of the Pay Equity Group at Seyfarth Shaw. And at Syndio, I work on a wide variety of issues, and I am so lucky to work with so many of our customers. But one of the topics that I work on a lot, and especially right now, is our global pay reporting product. So, very nice to be with you today to talk through this. Chris, I was wondering if you could ground us a little bit in terms of what is this pay gap? And we hear this stat so often that women are paid 84 cents on the dollar, or that's a new number. But I wondered if you might be able to define what we mean by pay gap as we're talking about it throughout this webinar.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, so the pay gap is the difference in average earnings between men and women, put most simply. And the reason we care about this is because ideally we would like to live in a world where workplace outcomes were not different for men and women. Where we would expect earnings to be similar between the two groups, but that's not the world that we live in today. There is some good news here, which is that the pay gap is the smallest that it's ever been. So this is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US that shows that the pay gap is the narrowest it's been. The bad news is that it's still quite wide at 84 cents on the dollar, or 16%. So women earn 16% less than men on average on a weekly basis here. So there's a lot of factors that go into this, but this is the real backdrop for this change in global reporting requirements, is that women earn less than men. If we look at this across the US, we know that every state has a pay gap as well. So while these pay gaps are relatively large in states like Idaho and Utah, and some states in the South and North Dakota, and relatively narrow in places like California and Vermont and New York, every state has the same dynamic at play, which is that women earn less than their male counterparts, right? And there's a lot of factors that play into this. And if you're interested in learning more about it, there's plenty of resources, including I recently published an article both about the US pay gaps by state and European pay gaps, which we'll look at next. So Michelle is dropping those links in too, but it's more complicated than women earning less than their male peers, although that's a part of it, right? So it's people performing similar work, women earning slightly less than the men that are performing the same job next to them. There's other factors that lead into it. Some of those are within a company's control, like opportunity equity, or women. We'll talk more about that later, but basically, do women have the same access to management and leadership roles through promotions? And then some other factors that are kind of more society-based that may not be within the purview of a single company to identify and address on their own. But long and short, there's a pay gap in all 50 states and in the District of Columbia. Women earn less than their male peers. When we look at Europe, things are wide.
I was just struck by the fact that it seems quite a wide span. And one of the findings I found so interesting from your research that you just recently did, that's captured in that Bloomberg article, is the fact that the states that have kind of have had laws over a longer period of time, and especially this cumulative effect of having stronger equal pay laws and salary history ban laws and pay scale disclosure laws and the like, that they seem to be additive, and that those states seem to have the smaller gaps to start. But I would love to hear just your thoughts on the impact of the laws on what we're seeing on those pay gaps by state.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's plenty to say about that research. So basically what we did is we looked at occupational pay gaps. So within people performing the same broad occupation, how are the pay gaps narrowing over time? And so within occupations, we see the same thing. We kind of mentioned this on that first slide about the pay gap, that the pay gap is getting smaller. it's not getting smaller that quickly. So typically when we forecast out, okay, well, when do we expect women to have the same earnings as men on average? Those are typically dates late this century or into next century. But we do see that pay gaps are closing in some of these jurisdictions, especially those that had larger pay gaps before and implemented laws that increase transparency or put some restrictions on salary history, bans, for example, in the job negotiation process. So states like Massachusetts and Illinois, and Colorado and Washington, and we see the pay gaps closing much faster in those states than they are nationally. And then New York and California are the other states that we think about as being kind of heavy hitters with long-standing or longer-standing laws that address these issues directly. And pay gaps were already smaller in those states too. So basically, we're seeing those states with these laws being leading the pack in terms of occupational pay gaps across the U.S. So as Christine mentioned, that's new research that launched today in Bloomberg. So please do go check it out. We'd love for you to see that.
Great. And then how about when we're looking at Europe, that this of course is not just something that's happening in the US, it's happening globally, but you did this kind of drill down into also looking at the pay gaps by country in Europe. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So in Europe, we see the same thing, which is across almost all European countries. There is one tiny exception in Luxembourg, which is in Luxembourg, women earn as much as their male peers. But in every other European country, women earn less than their peers. There's plenty to look at this map too. So there are some countries where the pay gap is smaller and some where it's larger. One thing that really stands out to me when I look at this map is some countries that we think about typically doing really well when it comes to gender equity in places like the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Report. Those are often the Nordics. So Iceland, Sweden, Norway, Finland all rank in the top 10. But their pay gaps are larger. So when it comes to labor market outcomes, of course, that's just one of the many components that feed into these gender gap reports. So there's all sorts of stuff like from inheritance rights and equal protections under the law for certain things. So those countries do really well, but there's still a large earnings gap between men and women in those countries. So key takeaway here is that what's going on in the US is also going on in Europe, which is that pay gaps exist. They're narrowing, but they're not narrowing at the rate that we'd want to see. And so that really provides the backdrop for why we're seeing increased legislation across the globe. And the real goal is to narrow these pay gaps. And some of that is by putting the screws to organizations, like putting pressure on organizations for those things that they can control, which is equal pay for equal work or work of similar value, and opportunity gaps as well. So let's talk about what do we mean when I say an opportunity gap. So what we're seeing here is data from the US. This is from a report that we released a couple of months ago. We'll talk a little bit more about this report later. But basically, an opportunity gap, as we define it, is there a difference in access to opportunities between different communities? And that can be hiring, promotions, and other forms of advancement. But one way that we've been tracking these opportunity gaps is just by saying, okay, well, how much more likely are men to occupy management and executive positions than women relative to their overall representation in the labor force? So you can see here that white men, this is in the US, using 2021 data from the EEOC, but white men make up 30% of all employees in the data set, yet they're 56% of executives and 42% of mid-level management, so non-executive management. So you can see this overrepresentation of white men in those groups. And then these are the two groups that face the largest opportunity gaps in the US, Black women and Latino women, where Black women are 8.4% of all employees, but only 2% of executives and 4.1% of mid-level management. And Latino women are 7.9% of all employees and 1.9% of executives and 4.1% of mid-level management. So you can see overrepresentation of white men in these groups, underrepresentation of women of color in particular, but women generally in these groups. And that's how we're tracking the opportunity gap at Syndio. So the opportunity gap also exists in all states, right? So this means that here we're looking at executive opportunity gaps. We've got the data available by state and industry, a lot of different ways we can look at it. Similar to pay gaps, opportunity gaps are closing. So there's been serious gains for women and people of color in management and leadership gaps over the past 12 years. And there's still a lot of ground to cover. So when we look at those forecasts of when do we expect these pay gaps or these opportunity gaps to close, we're still looking decades into the future. And you can see, I love calling out Wyoming here. Wyoming has the smallest opportunity gap. Wyoming is the equality state, right? The first state to have women's suffrage. But still the opportunity gap exists. And when we look at opportunity gaps for women of color, these gaps tend to be a lot larger, and for people of color too. So the same goes for pay gaps. I didn't mention it before, but basically when we layer race into these analyses in the US, we see that both pay gaps and opportunity gaps are larger for people of color and women of color in particular. Okay, so that's the opportunity gap. That's one thing that companies can control, right? Ultimately, companies decide who gets promoted. I guess, individuals have the opportunity to say no to a promotion. But generally, when it comes to employee development, we do see that at the employer level, there tends to be gaps in who gets those development and promotion opportunities. So you can read more about what's the state of the opportunity gap in the US in our report that we launched. Plenty of information here, including our forecasts on when those opportunity gaps will close. You're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that was really interesting to me is the fact that in Chris's research was showing this kind of direct correlation between either smaller gaps or more rapidly closing gaps, where we had states that focused on equal pay laws. And interestingly, we have an emerging trend of opportunity transparency laws, both in Illinois and Colorado, two of the states that were called out in Chris's research, and also in the EU. And so I would expect that as we look forward, we're just newly entering a new legislative season, and I would expect that we're going to see more of this, because as Chris had talked about earlier, the pay gap is a little bit about equal pay for equal work, certainly a portion of that, but it's a lot about equal access to opportunity. So these laws that are focused on the opportunity transparency in Illinois and Colorado, and as part of the EU's Equal Pay and Transparency Directive, will require that employers disclose pay or progression criteria. We see that in both the EU and in Colorado. Requirements that you have to post job promotions or job opportunities. We see that for some jobs in Illinois. We see that as part of the Colorado law. And then also information that you have to provide information about the selected candidate. So far, we're just seeing that in Colorado. Although Colorado has interestingly become one of the leaders in these more towards transparency laws in the US. And so I think that this is something that we're going to continue to see. And it goes to the fact that, or goes to the point that Chris had made about the fact that we have to really be looking at both of these things. And we're already seeing the way that the pay equity laws have impacted the pay gap. And I would expect that if we look out 5 years from now and Chris were to do some similar thing, we would see that the states that are focused on opportunity transparency we'll see closing gaps in those spaces as well, potentially. We're in early days on the opportunity transparency laws, but it's interesting. Chris, one thing that we were talking about earlier is that this is not something that is happening just in the US, but it's also something that's happening around the world. And we're focusing here on Europe because there's a significant amount of data there, but I wanted to, but certainly something that you're also seeing around the globe. But I wondered if you could talk to us about the opportunity gaps in Europe.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so we used a different data set here, obviously, to calculate what's the opportunity gap in Europe. Just for the record, our software OpEQ, we just expanded to a lot of global jurisdictions with occupational level benchmarks. So you can see how your organization compares in Slovenia, right, for women in management versus the national benchmark. So that's available
That's
now.
huge, Chris.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's huge. That was one of the things that when I was before I came to Syndio, it was like this data set that I just always felt like I couldn't unlock, which is we were able to use the EEOC and the census data to get pretty good idea of the benchmarks for US employees. But I hadn't seen a place where we're seeing kind of all of these or many, many, many countries that we had labor pool availability data for. So now that's part of our OPIQ product so that you can actually calculate what an aspirational target would be based on that data for over 100 countries. And that's already now in the OPIQ product. So that's exciting.
Yeah, we're really excited about it. And we use that data to calculate this that we're seeing here, which is the same math as we did for the US, which is, are women represented in management roles at the same rate as they're represented in the overall labor market in these countries? And what we see in Europe is the same that we see in the US, which is across all of these states, be they EU member states or not, women are underrepresented in management and leadership. There are a couple countries where this isn't the case. Poland and Romania, you can see on the map as having relatively small gender opportunity gaps where women are as equally represented in management as they are to the overall. But again, across countries, especially some of these ones that we tend to think about as being more progressive with respect to women's rights, such as the Nordics and Germany, actually have quite large opportunity gaps. So women are much less likely to be managers in those countries as men. And so the same thing appears in Europe. I think this is why, as you called out before, there's some of these opportunity transparency reporting requirements as part of the EU Directive, right? There's this requirement for organizations to track and post. So it's both reporting and it's some process stuff too, right? And Christine, obviously you're the authority on that. But what we see in the US is the same thing that we see in Europe, which is opportunity gaps exist. These are one of the core drivers of the pay gap. And it's also something that's within a company's control.
One of the areas that we're seeing kind of a flurry of activity is around the global pay reporting requirements. So right now, there are 28 countries with more jurisdictions because places like in the US, California and Illinois and Minnesota for state contractors have pay reporting requirements that layer on top of those what may be due at the country level. So there are 28 countries right now that have some type of pay reporting. And as we look down the line, this is going to be an area that we're going to see kind of increasing opportunity as the EU Equal Pay and Transparency Directive goes into effect in 2026, with the first report due on the 7th of June, 2027, across all of Europe. It's difficult to underestimate how much of an impact I think this will have on the world as we're looking at pay and opportunity. And I think that if we look at Chris's slides, the research that Chris did with the Bloomberg, that laws do move the needle over time, and especially laws that are more cumulative in nature. So not just suing people for pay gaps, but also things like enabling people to talk about their pay or the pay transparency laws. One of our colleagues, Nancy Romanishin, just has said to us so many times that it really just has completely changed the way that total rewards leaders focus on pay equity with these pay transparency laws. And that's what we see coming with the EU Equal Pay and Transparency Directive that's coming soon, with the first reporting in 2027. So on the next slide, we can talk a little bit about kind of how big of a change this is. So I mentioned before that there are 28 countries right now that require some kind of pay reporting. So there are 15 jurisdictions outside of Europe. So in the US, we have Brazil, Canada. There's also some requirements in individual provinces in Canada, in Chile, and in the US, in California, in Illinois, and state contractors in Minnesota. We also see pay reporting in countries that are not part of the European Union, but that do sit within Europe. So that's Iceland and Norway and Switzerland and the UK and Ukraine. And then we have more reporting requirements in countries outside of the US and Europe, where there's been outside of the US and the Americas, where there's been more of a concentration. So we have pay reporting requirements in Australia, in India, in Israel, Japan, Korea, and South Africa. So those ones are not going to change. Those 15 that I just mentioned are not going to change, at least immediately, or at least directly, because of the EU directive. But everything else, 27 of the 42 countries with reporting requirements, will be directly impacted by the new directive. So there will be 14 countries that are all listed here that don't have pay reporting obligations currently. And those are places like, Bulgaria and Croatia, but also the Netherlands and Poland, where we don't have pay reporting obligations right now, but they will as a result of the EU directive. It will be a new requirement. But then there's this other impact, which is there's 13 countries that do have current reporting obligations, but none of them have the exact same requirements as what's required by the EU directive. And we put into the appendix more information about, the ins and outs of exactly what's required by the EU directive. We're happy to talk about it, but we just had a lot to cover today and wanted to make sure that we got through all of that content. So when we look at this, we're talking about over 64% of countries that have reporting requirements are going to be directly impacted by the EU directive. And I think that the press and the focus that will be generated by this, just really, it's very difficult to underestimate, I think, the impact that this will have. And so I think what we're seeing is that employers are moving to an area that, even if you took a more decentralized approach to global reporting historically, that because of the fact that we're going to have 27 of the 42 kind of immediately impacted, and because we're having just more and more obligations, Brazil is like brand new to this list with the first report due this year. There's requirements that are changing, and there's many jurisdictions like New Zealand that are considering changes to their reporting obligations. We're just seeing this kind of snowballing effect as we see this global cross-pollination of all of these different laws happening all around the world. This is also very concentrated in the first half of the year. So one of the reasons that we really wanted to talk today as we move right in January is that the first half, so H1 of the year, is very heavy for pay reporting obligations. So these just deal with the ones that are currently required, not even looking down the line at the requirements that are coming as a result of the EU directive. But we have reporting in some country in every month between now and June. And in many places, there's multiple countries that are due each month. Some of these are required just once a year. And so if I'm looking at South Africa or Portugal or the UK or California, where you only have to file that report once a year. But many of them are actually more frequent. So in Brazil, for example, the requirement that you submit data to the government in Brazil, and then the Brazilian Ministry of Labor will prepare the pay gap. That must happen twice a year. So the first time that it will happen will be in February. The data will be due in February. And then in March, the Ministry of Labor, will publish the pay reporting. And then that will happen again that will happen again later in the year. So it's happening more frequently. Similarly, in Luxembourg, you must share your pay gap information with your staff delegation twice a year. And Ukraine has quarterly reporting requirements, although impacted by the war. There are other countries that have less frequent reporting obligations. So Austria, Finland, Italy, they require that you report every other year. Canada is going to be the first report, is not due until September, but you likely want to complete it by June so that you can get the feedback on the draft as required. And then that will be something that only needs to be done once every 5 years after that. And then there's different ones we put on here on this list, kind of the final deadline, but some of them I did want to mention, like Australia, the report is due sometime between the 1st of April and the 31st of May. So we put it on May, but some of these in Australia, in Austria, et cetera, can be filed even sooner. And then there's this fact that we have rolling or employer-specific deadlines. It could be because it is based on your fiscal year, like we see in Japan or in Norway. But it also could be because there's not a specific deadline outlined or articulated in the law. But often you have to stay on the same cadence, like in Sweden, that you previously followed. So those rolling or employer-specific deadlines are outlined at the bottom of this draft, or the bottom of this slide. So I think that all we wanted to say in this part is that there's a lot to do on global reporting, and it's happening right now because we have so many deadlines that happen at the first half of the year. Interestingly, like of all of those 28 countries that have reporting requirements, there are just a handful, like Denmark and Iceland and Ireland, that have reporting obligations in the second half of the year, although some of them, like Brazil and Ukraine, that report more frequently than once a year, will also be added to that list. So a lot going on right now, and we're hearing more and more from our customers and from folks that are looking at Syndio that they're looking for more support in this space because it's really coming like a train very, very quickly. And added on top of that, we're finding that employers are beginning to think about how they're going to prepare for the EU directive. So although the first report will not be due for any of those 27 member states with the new reporting requirements until the 7th of June, 2027, people are starting now because there are really only 2 comp cycles, and we're right in the middle of one of them, to make adjustments to be prepared for the reporting that will come as part of the EU directive. So again, for our customers, we're very happy to help you think through what is your approach and what is your process to looking at the reporting obligations. So Chris, I was going to turn this back over to you to talk through kind of how can we address what we're seeing coming down the line.
Yeah, great. So as Christine, I think, established really well, there's so much happening this year in terms of there's a lot that's on your plate in terms of reporting if you're a global organization that's already required. And then you have this big thing in the future, which is the Transparency Directive. So what should you do today, right? Well, first thing is make sure that you're up to date on your calendar of pay reporting obligations. We can help with that. That's one of the things that we help our customers with, as Christine mentioned. So you want to make sure that for every country that you operate in, where you meet the threshold requirement for reporting, that you're ahead of the ball and that you know that you have that requirement and that you know what it looks like, so that there are no surprises or missed deadlines for those reports.
And one thing
go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that one thing that that we get asked to do a lot is to help employers figure out there's different thresholds. So some of them kick in if you only have 10 employees in the country, but others, like Israel, kick in if you have 518 employees there, or Japan at 301 employees. they're all very different in terms of the reporting threshold. And so one of the things that we would be happy for anyone on this call to help with is to, if you want to send your CSM or reach out to Chris or to me, or to anyone else that you're working with at Syndio, if you want to know where you have reporting obligations based on your headcount in each country, if you share with us your headcount in each country, we just need country name and the headcount. For some of them, it's also broken down by legal entity. We are happy to put together for you a list of, here's where you have reporting obligations. This is what the reporting obligations are. This is when they're due. This is when you can begin to prepare for those. So definitely lean on us if that would be helpful at all to help figure out where you have reporting obligations. Often this is so decentralized that we find that at the more for the total rewards leaders or talent leaders, they may not actually, or CHROs, they may not know exactly where they have those reporting obligations. So happy to help with that if that's of use to anyone. Definitely reach out to us or reach out to anyone else that you're working with at Syndio.
Yeah, I think that brings up such a good point, Christine, when you think about how decentralized organizations can be. And if we think about, reporting requirements as living maybe within legal or compliance, and that may not be tightly aligned with total rewards, right? So the second thing that we have is, evaluate or prepare or verbalize your global pay reporting strategy. And if you wouldn't mind speaking just a little bit about that, like how can organizations think about how they not only comply, but also get a handle on these statistics and understand what they say about their organization and potentially respond.
Right. Yeah. So as we're thinking about, there's some jurisdictions right now that these are already public. So if we think of countries like the UK or Ireland or Japan or Israel, others as well, those we've built a little bit of the muscle around the fact that those are public. But when we imagine the fact that we're going to have 27 member states, most of Europe, all reporting on a single day. And also, as we look in the US, that it's very likely that we're going to see reporting happening in the US sometime this year. The EEOC has all but said that some type of pay reporting is coming back. And we're also seeing more states like Massachusetts and others evaluating additional reporting requirements in the US, that we're finding that employers are wanting to make sure that they're aligned in terms of what their strategies look like. And it requires not just calculating their gaps, although that's really a critical part and the part that we help with on Syndio Global Pay Reports, but also understanding kind of like what it means. So where do we have pay gaps? Where do we have opportunity gaps? And we're finding that employers that have the full Syndio platform, so both OPIQ and PayEQ, they're leaning on that pretty heavily to figure out what they're seeing in terms of their of what their gaps look like. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's just that the ability to understand kind of where you have your reporting, what are you going to do for reporting, how it's going to align to the way that you are doing your pay equity analyses and your opportunity equity analyses, to have those be coordinated strategies is just something that we're seeing, I think, kind of an increasing need to do.
Yeah. And I think about, especially as those things become public, right? You want to know what your plan is. If an employee comes and says, hey, this is our pay gap, what are we doing about it?
What does it mean? Right.
Yeah. As an employer, I don't think it's going to be enough to say like, yeah, we really should think about that. Right. But you want to have thought about it.
Right.
Which brings us into the next point. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that same thing, that like I would just love to hear from a labor economist perspective, like on how we're thinking about groupings and how that's different as we think about the EU directive.
Yeah. So grouping employees is kind of a critical step in any workplace equity analysis, right? So one thing it's both a blessing and a curse of this unadjusted pay gap is that it's a really blunt instrument, right? And so people are performing works in totally different functions, right? And so we know that accountants get paid differently than HR managers or janitorial staff or mechanics. And so there's always this component of like, okay, well, how do we compare like for like, and how do we determine, what's a what's driving these different pay gaps. And so grouping employees is an important step of that process. You want to know what your analytical unit is, what's your group that you're looking at. In the EU, those requirements are going to be different than they have been in the US. And a great place to start is Sweden. If you're already used to global reporting, the groupings that we'll see required under the EU directive are similar to those groupings. So it's both employees that are performing the same job, but it's also employees that are performing work of similar value or of equal value to the organization. And it may be that you put those all into one big group and that's your analysis. And it may be that you do two different analyses, one for employees performing the same job and one for employees performing jobs of similar or equal value. But, it depends on how companies transpose that, and we'll learn more before the EU directive actually works out. But in any case, now is a good time to start thinking about those groupings for your organization in the EU and performing those analyses, which brings us into this last point of what can organizations do today to start preparing? What should you do first? And this is really just getting a handle on your internal analytics and understanding the dynamics of the employee lifecycle from application to separation. How are different communities faring? How are women faring compared to men in the US? How are people of color faring compared to white workers or white applicants at your organization? Because you want to understand if there are barriers, where those barriers occur, and how they're driving the pay gap at your organization. And this is going to allow you to create tailored interventions that may help, right? So we think about like, okay, well, if you're getting, Black applicants to your organization, but none of them are making it to hire, that's a really different issue than a big retention gap or a difference in promotion rates, or equal pay for equal work. All of those things present challenges to your organization. They just have really different interventions. So the next thing is you want to get a handle on a holistic analytical framework that can help you identify where those gaps exist specific to your organization. Okay, so talking a little bit about that in more detail. This is just an illustration of the employee lifecycle. So we've got recruiting, right? Kind of the pre-employment process where applicants learn about your company and they apply, and then they go through this recruiting funnel. And there may be inequities that exist there, right? In the US, there's kind of a long history of laws that address this recruiting funnel and hiring differences. And it's unlawful to discriminate in this process. And so you want to make sure that your organization isn't doing that, even if it's just statistical discrimination. So if it's not, outwardly gender or race-based behaviors, but just sort of a different rate at which people make it through these processes, even though they're similarly qualified, that's something that you'll want to know about. So that goes from recruiting to hiring. Then you've got employee development, things like performance reviews and work assignment. And that leads to things like promotions or the failure to promote an individual, and that can impact retention. So are retention rates similar? And then ultimately, at some point, employees are going to separate from your organization, but you definitely want to know if you're losing women at a much higher rate than you're losing men, or if you're losing women in leadership at a much higher rate than you're losing men in leadership. So what we want to do is we want to layer an analytical framework onto this understanding of the employee lifecycle. And this can feel a little overwhelming. We're certainly here to help. This is why we built an entire platform that covers things from representation gaps to pay gaps, to performance rating analysis to promotion gaps, right? But ultimately, we want to put this analytical lens on your data at each point in this employee lifecycle, and that will tell you, okay, at our organization, what are the specific issues that we face? What I would say generally is that in the US and in Europe, we know that there are differences at each of these stages, right? So there's reason to suspect that you may have an issue at your organization. But what we see with our customers is that that's not always the case. So even within an organization, you may have a pay equity issue within one department, and you may have an issue in performance ratings in a different department. But it behooves you, especially as we're preparing for increased transparency and reporting, to know specifically what are the communities that are facing barriers, where in the employee lifecycle are they facing barriers at our organization, and then what is our response to those barriers going to be? And the easiest one, obviously, is pay equity, where if you know that there's a difference in pay rates between men and women, you just pay women more who are performing similar work and are otherwise similarly qualified. are similarly positioned to men in those roles. In some cases, it's going to be a more holistic approach, right? So if you're failing to promote a particular community, you may think about, okay, well, what is it about our organization that's not giving the same opportunities here, and how can we address that? So ultimately, what is this last step? So you have a sense of kind of thinking back to those 4 steps that we talked about. You want to know what reporting requirements you have. You want to know what your plan is for those requirements. You want to think about your groupings, and then you want to think about ensuring employee equity throughout the life cycle. This slide here is a little different, 4 different points, but this is about how we at Syndio can help with that as well. So first thing is ensure equal pay for equal work, or work of equal value. So once you've got your employee groupings put together, you want to conduct an analysis that says, okay, is pay similar between men and women or other communities within this job group? If it's not, can we explain why it's not using neutral job related factors? PayEQ is really the leading software solution for that sort of analysis. It's our flagship product. It's what we started with. Next is tracking and analyzing representation gaps and what's driving those representation gaps at your organization. So is it about promotions, performance management, attrition, retention, et cetera? Our
And
software.
Yeah,
Go
and
ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's awesome because now we can we could always look at movement and promotions and performance with a global lens, but on the representation side, having access to that ability to have the representation data, not just in the US, but in 100 countries around the globe, I think is going to be a way that employers can really get their arms around, like, what is their reporting strategy? What is it? What's actually driving what they're seeing? Because they're going to be able to benchmark themselves against those metrics, which I think is really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And, our review of those global benchmarks shows that there are big differences, right? So,
Yeah, that's what
know,
I guess you're seeing it in the US, in Europe, but it's probably even more so if we look at other jurisdictions outside of Europe as well. That's interesting.
yeah. 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 So representation of women in management, it's really different across the globe. And you want to make sure that you have that piece of context when you're evaluating your own operations within those countries, right?
Right.
And so OPIQ can help with that as well.
Mhm.
Global pay reports, Christine is the expert on this. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we also help with global pay reporting for our customers as well. And then the last bit that rounds out our equity platform, workplace equity platform, is Payfinder. This allows you to make sure that your pay decisions that you're making at the margin, right? So when we hire someone into a role, or we promote someone or transfer someone, that the pay makes sense, right?
Mhm.
And that it's internally consistent. They're going to be paid similar to their peers, and we're not introducing new biases into our processes. We see this with our customers too, right? Where the primary driver of pay gaps that weren't existing in a job group last year but have occurred here, or that are recurring, is those decisions that we make when new people are hired into the group, or when promotions are made. That's what causes pay gaps to appear in these different job groups. And so Payfinder is a solution that helps us get ahead of that and ensure that we're not bailing water out of the boat as we have a hole that's putting water back into
Right.
it, right? So we're
Right.
getting ahead of it and addressing the root cause. But Christina, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about global pay reports.
Yeah, perfect. And then we really want to get to FAQs. So definitely drop your questions. We have some already, but please continue to add any questions that you may have, either to the chat or to the Q&A with your name. That would be great. So Syndio supports on our global pay reporting side. We're a one-stop shop for all of those global reporting requirements. We cover 29 jurisdictions, just the distinction between countries, and then some countries have multiple within there in Europe, in the US, and then also around the globe. We have 3 kind of key deliverables with that, and a lot more to come. I'm so excited about what's on our roadmap with Syndio Global Pay Reports. But we have kind of 3 key deliverables. So we provide you an instructions and guide that really outlines how do we group employees, and when we have some questions in there that I'm going to get to in just a second about How do we know if we actually meet the threshold reporting for that jurisdiction, or what counts as a full pay relevant employee, or do we include overtime, or do we include bonus, or what do we do about equity and the like? We answer all of those questions in that instructions and guide. So on the next slide, we could just hit to that really quickly, and then we can take down the slides. But we have the instructions and guide. We have a really detailed data template that outlines exactly the data that we need with definitions for each jurisdiction. And then we provide a report that calculates the and delivers the key metrics and model narratives and communications advice. And we have that for each of the 29 jurisdictions. So really, really excited about that. So without further ado, I was going to start hitting some of these questions. If that was okay. Okay, perfect. So great question, which is, how do we know if this is specific about California, but how do you know if you meet the employer size threshold? So this employer crossed the employee threshold in October, but their average headcount is below 100. And so do they have to file, or do they not have to file? And it's a great, again, this isn't legal advice, but I'm quoting very, but there's an FAQ that I can drop in just a second that outlines the answer to this very question. So the way that California calculates it is that if an employer has fewer than 100 employees, then they are not required to file the report in California. That said, not all 100 employees have to be in California. So even if you had, let's say that you're like an employer, you're based in Illinois, you have 500 employees, but you have 2 employees that live in California, or you have labor contractors in California, you would still have to file the report, even if all of those employees are not in California. The way that the state of California has defined whether or not you meet that 100 employee threshold, I'll talk about labor contractors separately, is they look at it through 2 lenses, and it's an or. So if you're either or on these, so if you had more than 100 employees during the snapshot period, so you look at a payroll period sometime between October and December, if you had more than 100 employees during that snapshot period, then you would have to file. Or if you have 100 or more regularly employed employees during the reporting period. So for the question asker, because it has an or, not an and, at least according to the FAQs, the state of California is typically looking for employers to file if they either employed them during that snapshot period, or they had 100 or more regularly employed employers during that period. There's additional obligations if you have requisite number of labor contractors. So if that wasn't the question, but just wanted to mention that as well. And I'll drop this FAQ into the chat. Here we go. And then I'll look at, I haven't looked at it to figure out exactly which number it is, but here it is. It's in section 111C, which employers are required to file the report is outlined there. So that was a great question.
One thing I would just like to add that I think is really interesting about these jurisdictional differences too, is that we do see these spillover effects, like with Colorado and New York City and California, right? Where the state has the requirement, but it's also impacting how organizations that operate a little bit in those states or cities or jurisdictions think about their entire process, right? So we do see an increasing number of employers that are saying, hey, our approach is going to be that whatever the strictest requirement is in the US, we're just going to do that across the US. And that gets us ahead of the ball in terms of jurisdiction that's coming down the pike. And then we don't have to worry too much about, failing to comply with one state's requirements, because we do it in all states already. So
yeah, that's exactly right.
There's also one quick question here that just is, when is the California report?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So it's due the 2nd Wednesday of May. So for this year, it's due on May but it changes. So last year it was due like May 10th, I think, but it switches a little bit. But for this next year, for the reporting based on your 2023 year, is going to be due on the 8th of May of 2023. And we're happy to help with any of that as part of Global Pay Reports. That's definitely one of the jurisdictions that we support. And there's some really exciting things that are happening in product as well as with respect to the California Pay Report. We're very, very excited about. So that was a really good question. I had another kind of direct question that came just to me about the reporting in Brazil, about a couple of questions about that. So the first question was, do you have to actually calculate the metrics for the report filing in Brazil? And the answer is no. It was not clear at all in the law, but when the regulations and the ordinance came out, that explained more about the reporting requirements, it was very clear that you have to submit two things to in Brazil. So you're already required to submit data through eSocial. You'll continue to do that. They're going to leverage the data that employers in Brazil file through eSocial. And then there's the new section of the Ministry of Labor that's just newly opened, that you'll submit additional data, and that has to be done by February. And then the Ministry of Labor is going to actually calculate the gaps based on the data that is submitted. And then employers are going to have to publish that. And so we are working with many employers that are trying to get their arms around what we think those reporting requirements or what those calculations are going to look like. It's a little bit of a guess because they're definitely building the plane and flying it in Brazil right now, because the law was passed quite late into the year and the reporting is due quite early in the year. And so, but again, happy to help with that. It's also one of the jurisdictions that we cover as part of Syndio Global Pay Reports.
Great. We had one more really excellent question about pay equity analyses, particularly in the EU, which is, what do we see as best practice for which pay component to use as the basis for pay equity reviews? Base salary, total cash compensation, so fixed pay plus incentives, or do we want to include benefits value and equity value, fringe benefits? It's much harder data to collect.
Yeah.
I love this question. One thing I'd say is that there's not a single way that there's like a legally required way to look at this. And Christina, I'll definitely allow you to speak up on that. We have built flexibility into pay EQ, because even if we see a pay gap with total cash compensation, you might want to know, well, is that driven by differences in base pay, or is it driven by differences in cash incentives, right? And so it's helpful to have the flexibility to look at it multiple ways. That's built into pay EQ. And then there's also the statutory and reporting requirements as well. So Christina, I'll let you take that as a lawyer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is the definition of pay under the EU directive is very broad. So it includes not only base pay, but also all complementary and variable components of pay. And so they listed as examples any benefits, in addition to your kind of base salary, benefits, cash, whether or not it's in cash or in kind. And so it's quite broad in terms of what is included as the requirement. So they list things like bonuses, overtime, travel facilities, housing and food allowances, compensation for attending training, payments in case of dismissal, statutory sick pay, statutory required compensation. And one requirement, Michelle, I don't know if you want to just pop open the slides and go to 24 for just a quick second. But one of the requirements, this is in the appendix, so you'll get it when the deck comes out. But one of the requirements is that not only are you calculating the overall mean and median pay gap, but that you're also calculating the mean and median pay gap by each of those individual complementary or variable components of pay. So I think of it like a lot like Spain in that way, that you're calculating the overall, but also by all those individual components of pay as well.
Well, this is great. And I'll say that if you in the audience aren't convinced that Christina is the expert that you want on your side when you're approaching your global pay reports, I don't know what would convince you. I think it's so great to hear you talk about this, Christine. And we are, I think, a little over time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all joining. We really appreciate it. And thanks for hanging with us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. We're going to be going into more on reporting. We have a SIPs and salaries coming up on global pay reporting. So lots to come, and really, really thrilled that we get to work with you as you go through this journey. Thanks a lot.
Thanks all. See you. Bye.